Hello there, I am the Gusano historian. Today's topic will include some speculation, as we obviously cannot read the mind of Fidel Castro, nor is he alive today. In this video, I'll try and paint a timeline of how Fidel Castro became a Marxist-Leninist and a bit of why he ended up leading a successful revolution. Most of my information will come from a book authored by Hugh Thompson titled Cuba, A History. I do recommend reading this book, but fair warning, I wouldn't say it's a Marxist historiography work like Howard Zinn, People's History, but does an okay job for giving a full history of Cuba from its early days under Spanish colonial rule to the Republican days to the Cuban Revolution and beyond. Feel free to comment with a better book that covers the entire history of Cuba. I would appreciate it. This video will not be a whole history of Cuba, but rather to answer a common question about Fidel Castro, which is when did he become radicalized in Marxism-Leninism? Or was he a communist from the get-go? Depending on your political leanings, your assumptions could swing from he was a communist from the get-go to someone who got radicalized during or after the end of the revolution. This video will also talk about his father and how he had an influence on his son. Fidel Castro was born in 1926 in Biran, a village in the Holguin province of Cuba. The Holguin province is adjacent to Guantanamo province, and these two provinces, among others, were once called the Oriente province, roughly meaning eastward or eastern in Spanish. But by 1976, the Cuban government split the Oriente province into their respective provinces. Anyway, back to Castro. Castro was born under a wealthy family. His father, Angel Castro, once owned up to 18,000 acres, roughly 73 kilometers squared, of land at its peak, and died a few years before the Cuban Revolution. Angel Castro was a Spaniard from Galicia, born to a peasant family. Galicia is the Celtic region of Spain that had an influence on the Cuban accent today, especially in the easternmost provinces, historically known as the Oriente. Angel Castro went to fight for Spain in the Cuban War of Independence. This meant that Angel was a staunch supporter of Spain and disliked the United States of America, which he called the enemy of the North, a view that would have an impact on Fidel, his son. This is not to say that Angel wasn't a capitalist, because he was and had no issues exploiting workers, especially the Haitian migrants. More on that in a moment. Angel was right to criticize the United States at the time, since the USA never had the intention of letting Cuba become truly independent and have its ability for self-determination. This was because of the first intervention by the United States on Cuba. USA even got to codify this neocolonial rule under the Platt Amendment in the US Constitution, which became effective in 1901 after Cuba, with the help of the United States, defeated the Spanish in the Cuban War of Independence. Here is an example excerpt of the Platt Amendment from Article 3 and Article 7, which I believe is the most egregious articles in this amendment. Article 3 states that the government of Cuba consents that the United States may exercise the right to intervene for the preservation of Cuban independence, the maintenance of a government adequate for the protection of life, property, and individual liberty, and for discharging the obligations with respect to Cuba imposed by the Treaty of Paris on the United States, now to be assumed and undertaken by the government of Cuba. And Article 7, that to enable the United States to maintain the independence of Cuba and to protect the people thereof, as well as for its own defense, the government of Cuba will sell or lease to the United States lands necessary for coaling or naval stations at certain specified points to be agreed upon with the President of the United States. Yikes. By the way, Article 7 is practically alluding to the Guantanamo Bay, which is basically an illegal settlement by the United States military, and it should be illegal under international law, but, it's the world. No one gives a crap about that, unfortunately. Anyway, you can see why this was problematic for the self-determination of Cuba and how it planted a seed for revolution later on. The U.S. intervened in Cuba in 1898 and ruled Cuba militarily in what was called the United States Military Government in Cuba. This will end in 1902, but a second intervention soon will occur in 1906, all the way up until 1909. During the second intervention, even a U.S. president ruled as a Cuban governor. It was Howard Taft, the only U.S. president, as far as I'm aware, to be a governor of another country, in this case Cuba. The period from 1909 through 1959 was known as the Republic of Cuba, but it goes by other names depending on your political leanings. Cuban exiles referred to it as Free Cuba. Ironically, it was far from free. More on that later. It was also known as the Neocolonial Republic of Cuba, which was an accurate description given it was a neo-colony under the US. More on this later as well. Once the war was over, Angel Castro in 1914 started getting his first piece of land in Biran and made business connections with the US. He hired laborers, mainly Haitians, and exploited them. This was in part a huge reason why Angel Castro got so wealthy. No surprise, but had to mention it. His initial 200-acre land was used for poultry, lumber, sugarcane, and maize. His next major purchase was a finca or village called Manancas, which had its own stores, slaughterhouses, and bakery. There were a total of 27 buildings among them: a school, teacher's house, cockpit, movie theater, store, bar, billiard, telegraph, post office, workshop, and where the Haitian workers lived, and drugstore. Neighbors who failed to pay their debts might find themselves boxing for their lives in a human cockpit. How fun. Angel Castro initially worked for United Fruit Company. You heard that right, the same company that would whine over nationalization of resources and cry to the US for protection, or its puppet allies. Many lives were definitely destroyed because of the CIA and the United Fruit Company. But I digress. If you heard about this company before, that is because it was a famous US company before and now rebranded under Chiquita Brands International. So if any of you are watching, I highly recommend avoiding that brand. Any of my South American viewers, if you ever see Chiquita in your area, please run the heck out. In all seriousness, once Angel Castro had enough money to buy his own land to employ/exploit laborers, he left United Fruit Company. Now that we know a bit about Fidel's father, let's skip to the time Fidel was born. Fidel Castro was born in 1926. His mother was Angel's second mistress. He would marry Lina Ruz Gonzalez in 1943, but Angel was married before to another woman, Maria Luisa Argota Reyes, a school teacher. During that time, many women were teachers, and it was very common for them to be school teachers. According to the people who raised him, Fidel Castro could be described as rebellious, and he was indeed rebellious very early on in his life. He was definitely aware of inequality, even if he hadn't been radicalized in Marxism, or even read any of his works. He will eventually, during his 20s, near the end of his college education. An interesting fact about Fidel is that he organized a workers' strike against his father at the age of 13. It was a sugarcane workers' strike, and of course they wanted better working conditions and better compensation. He definitely loathed his father, and where they agreed, the disagreement was merely on how they hated the USA. One important influence on Fidel Castro was his Jesuit education. Jesuits, for those who do not know, are a Catholic order that in recent history has been more left-wing than other Catholic organizations. Jesuits should sound familiar if you know the current Catholic Pope. This, of course, doesn't mean the Jesuits were Marxists or in favor of socialism and communism, but they would have been more sympathetic to inequality, and a lot of right-wing fascists will incorrectly label these Jesuits as communists, which is not the case typically. Anyway, Fidel attended a private school called Colegio de Belén, Colegio meaning school or college, and Belén referring to Bethlehem. This private Catholic high school should sound familiar if you live in Miami, Florida, as in 1962 it moved to Miami as private property stopped existing. Thus, it couldn't operate as a private school no longer. You will hear many Cuban exiles refer to Castro as purging the Jesuits, but in reality, these private institutions voluntarily left the island. Castro didn't make them leave in one sense. They left because private property ceased to exist, but that's not what a purge is. This will, of course, apply to most Cuban exiles who left the island, including my own father, a Cuban exile himself, including his parents as well. Many Cuban exiles will also say pre-Castro Cuba was free because private property existed and economic freedom. By the way, economic freedom is a liberal term and is how liberals, including neoliberals, define freedom. Most people obviously do not think of freedom in these terms. Also, freedom is a very abstract concept. The term freedom will mean differently from person to person. Make note of this, as you will see many people calling for freedom. I'm looking at you, PragerU. That being said, let's say that private property is a great right, and people should own property again. Don't confuse private ownership with possession. A common anti-communist trope is you'll own nothing under communism or socialism, which is ironic given the state of technology and DRM under capitalism. But that's another subject unrelated to this channel. That being said, at the height of the neo-colonial era of Cuba, by 1956, the U.S. owned over 90% of telephone and electric services, about 50% of public service railways, and about 40% of raw sugar production, and almost a fourth of all bank deposits in Cuba. In terms of farming land, by 1958, 73.3% of Cuba's available farming land was concentrated in the hands of just 9.4% of landowners. So granted these statistics are accurate, this means that private property was only enjoyed, and that's saying lightly of course, because they were basically extremely privileged, anybody who owned land. Mind you, the Gini coefficient or any meaningful data from pre-Castro era is lacking. But these stats alone would disprove the notion that Cuba was free before Castro, because you could start a business or own a land. The problem was huge swath of inequality, and I wouldn't be surprised if it made the U.S. Gini coefficient look like a socialist paradise by comparison. For those who don't know, the Gini coefficient is a measurement of inequality, a standard today and measured by most countries, usually by the country itself, so you do have to take the numbers with a grain of salt. The values range from 0 through 1, where 0 and 1 are both extreme ends, and there probably isn't a state with either strict equality or strict inequality. Usually a state has a number in between 0 and 1. The larger the number, the more inequality. The smaller the number, the less inequality, or more equality. The coefficient was developed by 1912, but the neo-colonial republic didn't care to measure it, and for good reason. So now that we have some context of the economic state of Cuba pre-Castro era, we can see how that influenced Fidel Castro. In fact, when Fidel Castro was going to school, he noticed his classmates, many had to walk barefooted to school. The area where he lived, only 1% had a university education background. A luxury for sure for many of the students who did end up studying in a university. It is why many Marxist revolutions happen with someone who's typically educated. Not to offend the uneducated, it isn't necessarily your fault that education is lacking. It's a systemic issue and not a personal or moral failing. It is why the Cuban Revolution was led by a man who was born in a wealthier family. Many of the things in the area where Fidel lived were privately owned by the United States Fruit Company. I guess this shouldn't be a shock given that many businesses in Cuba were American owned, as we just alluded earlier. Given this context, it isn't hard to see that Castro was ambitious in ending the inequality, and that the inequality was a major recipe for revolution, like most revolutions around the world. That being said, Oriente Province was definitely the region with the most U.S. influence and most brutally exercised. Once Castro finished attending high school, he attended Havana University. While his father wasn't educated, given his Galician peasant background, and although his father was skeptical of American consumerism and culture, he nonetheless sent his children to get educated, as he believed it would bring more prosperity to the family. Fidel Castro decided to study law because people would say he talks a lot, he should be a lawyer. So Castro wanting to learn law was partly because people would say to him, you should be a lawyer. Obviously, he had other ambitions, but learning law would prove useful to him. While studying in university, this is where he would start to get more in touch with Marxist works, but also read Hitler, Lenin, and Mussolini. This isn't to say Fidel was a fascist, but like most people interested in political theory, it is tempting to read other theories beyond your favorites. Castro, during his college years, got involved with overthrowing the Dominican dictatorship and was part of various rebellious groups. Now, to answer the question of when Fidel Castro turned Marxist-Leninism, it was much after the revolution. Although by 1953, his younger brother Raul Castro was already radicalized and had joined a communist conference in Vienna in that same year, Fidel Castro was starting the 26th of July movement, most likely only knew superficial knowledge of communism and Marxism. Sort of like how many people have read a bit of Marx's work, but didn't take anything further with. Luckily, Castro answered this question in 1961, and I quote, "Did I believe in Marxism on the 26th of July, 1953? I believed on the 26th of July. Did I understand it as I understand it today after 10 years of struggle? No, I did not understand it as I understand it today. There is a great difference. Did I have prejudices? Yes, I had prejudices. Yes, I had them on the 26th of July. From this quote, we can see that Castro at the time of the start of the revolution understood there were problems, but didn't really have a grasp of Marxist theory. In my opinion, Castro was more influenced by Cuban nationalism like Jose Marti in the early years up until 1961. Then he officially declared himself a Marxist. His brother, on the other hand, was a communist already and initially only joined the revolution because it was his older brother. That being said, it all worked out because 1961, Fidel did declare himself a Marxist-Leninist till death, and he did keep that promise. Rest in peace. This will lead to further conflict with the U. This will obviously lead to further conflict with the U.S., but that is another subject and for another video. I do hope you like this video, and please like or dislike, and if you do like, please subscribe. I can't promise much since I just started out, but I do want to talk about more Marxist historiography, including the American Revolution, the American Civil War, and among other videos in regards to Cuba, my country of origin. I am the Gusano historian, and hasta mañana.